Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's Snak Pak. We're back with a big update the NTSB released yesterday on Valentine's Day. We're going to get right into it because there's a lot of stuff to go over here. All right, so I'm going to try to help you decode a little bit of what they're saying. Now, this is footage. This right here is Jennifer Homendy. She's the chairman of the NTSB, and she's been given some really great updates. Again, when you listen to NTSB give you updates, they are not speculating. All right, they're giving us the raw facts as they see it. Their investigation is going to go on for probably over a year, gathering data, but they're giving us some preliminary findings, and some of it may be a little bit hard to understand. So I'm going to kind of break it down for you from the perspective of both a helicopter and an airplane instructor pilot. All right, so we'll get right into it. You can watch this video on YouTube, but they also released the chairman's full remarks, basically a transcript here that you can pull up on ntsb.gov. So she started out talking about how it was a check ride. Okay, I addressed this in an earlier video, but Army helicopter pilots have to do an annual check ride, and part of that you have to do it under NVGs. She goes on to say you do an instrument, annual, and night vision goggles. A lot of times the annual and the NVG get put into one check ride. All right, and that's fine. And then you also have to do an instrument evaluation. Make sure you can fly an instrument flight plan. Right? So those were combined, and that's very, very normal to do that. She then goes on to talk about how they were likely wearing the night vision goggles and they didn't hear anything on the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, saying that they were unaided. All right, so that's something that we coordinate with each other as a crew. All right, I just did this the other night. I was flying with night vision goggles. I was training a student, and then we did a instrument pickup. All right, so I called air traffic control and said, hey, I'd like a pop-up clearance to do an instrument approach. We climbed up much higher where we didn't really need the NVGs, and I said, front left, there's just a seat I was sitting in, front left is going unaided, and I flipped my goggles up, right? So we have to coordinate with each other, and then the other pilot did the same thing. Right front, unaided. Okay, cool. Now we all know, like, nobody's wearing NVGs, right? So we're all unaided. So they didn't hear that on the cockpit voice recorder, and that indicates that very likely they were wearing the NVGs. So what does it look like through the NVGs? Well, a common analogy we use is you take a couple toilet paper rolls, all right, the empty rolls, and when you're done with the toilet paper, you put a couple of those over your eyes, and that's about what you're seeing, all right? So it's already been revealed that they have a 40-degree field of view, all right? That's not a lot, right? You're getting more than 180 on a lateral axis with your eyes just without these goggles on. So imagine your vision's restricted to this 40-degree field of view. Now they are in front of you a little bit, so I'll play this quick video. So this video starts in the dark of night, and this is all the phone could capture. This is all the camera could capture here, and then we put it under the NVGs, and that's about what it looks like. So you're getting some pretty good visual, but it's in this very restricted little circle. That little circle is about all you're seeing, and you have one in each eye, and they kind of combine to make one circle, right? And that's all you can see. So in order to be able to see with these NVGs, the helicopter pilots have to scan, right? Basically, that means you just keep moving your head around. Imagine if you had a little flashlight with a very focused little beam and you walked into a closet looking for something, right, in a dark closet. You wouldn't just hold it in front of you, right? You could kind of move it all around. Well, in this case, the NVGs are attached to your head, your helmet, so you kind of just have to keep like moving your head around and keep scanning, all right? And it's definitely, it requires some training and some practice to get it down. But you can also see out the side of the goggles and underneath the goggles unaided, right? Just like a normal night with your normal night vision, right? So you can kind of like move your head to the side and you can see other things. You can see other aircraft lights or ground lights or whatever it is, right? But it does make your vision, it does give you a little bit of tunnel vision if you're not moving your head around. What they didn't tell us is whether or not they were using a heads-up display. All right, she then goes on to talk about the charts. Here's this chart we brought up. She's talking about altitude restrictions, right? So Cabin John and Chain Bridge, right? There's a 1,300-foot restriction. That's this one right here that we were talking about. And here's the Chain Bridge, 1,000 feet, right? 1,000 feet at Chain Bridge, 700 feet just after the Chain Bridge. That's right here, right? So we're just kind of following along. 300 feet at the Key Bridge. All right, here's the 300 feet restriction. And 200 feet just south of Memorial Bridge. So here's the Memorial Bridge, and then here's the 200-foot restriction that they were that anyone on Route 1 is required to follow. She did also say there are no defined boundaries on this route. So although you see these lines, there's no defined boundaries. So you've heard some people say that they shouldn't have been so far to the west. The Blackhawks shouldn't have been so far to the west, but there's no defined boundary here. So they didn't break any rules. Even if they did come a little bit to the left, there's nothing prohibiting them from doing that. But there was a 200-foot altitude restriction. That's where it's going to get a little dicey. So let's continue on. All right, it starts off here at 8:15. The CRJ left 37,000 feet. So these CRJs fly really high, right? If you've ever been on a commercial airline, that's about where you're flying, right? Several miles above the earth. The Black Hawk was picked up up to the north over here, and it was flying to Davison Army Airfield. Okay, so they were flying to Davison Army Airfield. They came down Route 1. They were approved to fly down Route 1, and then which subsequently turns into Route 4 here, and they were heading down to Davison Army Airfield, which was here. That's the destination. I'm not sure if they originated from there, but it's likely they did, right? So somehow they got up here. We don't really know anything about their data or their flight path before then, but they were up here on Route 1. They followed it down, and that was their destination, was Davison Army Airfield. Then the Black Hawk reached the intersection of DC Beltway. They began descending. Let's see, the CRJ was approved for the Mount Vernon Visual Runway 1 approach. So if we tap on DCA, we can pull up some procedures. We can look at approach procedures. And here's the Mount Vernon Visual Runway 1, all right? So this is coming in. Here's the airport. You can see this. These are the runways of the airport. And this was the approach they were cleared for. There's that Woodrow Wilson Bridge. And so originally they were supposed to do this approach. That's what they're telling us here. So that would have put them down here in this vicinity, and then they were going to follow it straight in for runway 1. Runway 01 is right here, and then runway 33 is right here. And subsequently, they were told to switch to runway 33. Now, this is where you'll see there's some communication problems, all right? This happens all the time. So CRJ rolled out on a left turn established on the ILS localizer for runway 1. All right, the localizer is this little beam that shoots out. It uses radio signals, and they have instrumentation that they can follow that will keep them aligned with the runway. Even if the weather's really bad and they're flying through the clouds and they can't even see the airport up ahead, they'll be able to follow those instruments, and it'll guide them right into that airport. It's incredibly accurate, and it's been used for decades. Right? An ILS, it's an instrument landing system. The localizer is the part that keeps them aligned with the runway horizontally. And there's usually a glide slope. An ILS also has a glide slope that will keep them vertically, right, on a descent path perfectly down to the runway. And they can get as low as 200 feet, sometimes 100 feet, or even lower. And even without any visual, can't see anything, and they'll pop out of the clouds and be able to be perfectly lined up with the runway. It's actually super cool and a lot of fun, in my opinion, to fly. They were cleared for that approach for 01, and then the approach controller told them, hey, contact tower next, right? So they're getting closer to the airport. So the tower operator over here at DCA asked them, hey, can you guys switch to runway 33? And they said, roger that, we'll switch to runway 33. So they started coming along this path. You can follow my cursor. They were lined up for runway 1, but now they're going to kind of come around and swing around and circle to land for runway 33, right? So they call that a circling approach because they're not coming straight in, right, like they would have been for the runway 01. It's a circling approach now, so they have to kind of swing around and shoot it visually. So now they're not really using those instruments anymore. They can see the airport, they can see the runway, and they're like, okay, yep, I got it. I'm going to circle around for runway 33. All right, they talk about flaps and everything, and that's just flaps. If you don't know, flaps just allow the airplane to fly slower. An airplane has to have forward momentum, or else it will stall, right? It will just fall out of the sky. Versus a Black Hawk or a helicopter, which can hover in one spot. An airplane can't do that. It has to maintain forward momentum. If you've ever been on a commercial airliner, likely you've touched down at over 100 knots, right? Which is like over 100 miles per hour. Knots are just a little bit faster than miles per hour. So you're touching down really, really fast, right? Probably faster than you've ever driven in a car. And you have to, because if it gets too slow, it's going to stall. Now flaps will allow the airplane to fly a little bit slower. They retract down the back of the wing, and they create a little more lift, and they let us fly a little bit slower, but it also slows the plane down. So when we're up at altitude, we don't want those, so we retract them and pull them back up. But whenever they're coming into land, that's what the flaps do for the airplane. So you probably heard that term before. That's what they're used for. Now at 844, the Black Hawk approached Key Bridge. The instructor pilot indicated that they were at 300 feet and descending. So right about here, they were at 300 feet and on their way down to 200 feet. Autopilot was disconnected, and they began shallow right turn off runway 1 localizer. So this is when they said, okay, well, the autopilot was probably following that ILS localizer, right? And then they said, okay, well, we'll disconnect, we'll fly manually, and then they flew around. So the pilot of the CRJ was manually flying on the yoke, and they pulled it around and swung it around for runway 33. Now at 8:45, the Black Hawk passed over Memorial Bridge. Remember, at Memorial Bridge, they have to be at 200, and the instructor pilot, right? Remember, the instructor pilot was also the pilot not on the controls, or in other words, the pilot monitoring. The pilot flying was the pilot being evaluated. We'll take a look real quick at a cockpit of the helicopter they were flying. This is the UH-60 Lima. Now, we don't know which seat they were in yet, but most of the time, if I'm giving an evaluation, I'm sitting in the left seat as the instructor, and the person being evaluated, or the student pilot, or whoever it is sitting in the right seat. And likely for risk mitigation, because the pilot who was being evaluated had fewer hours and was not the pilot in command, for risk mitigation, I would probably would have put the crew chief in the seat behind on the right, and they would have been facing out the side of the helicopter, very likely, right, facing like the 3 o'clock position. So on the left side, and this is kind of where the collision happened, the pilot on the left side would have, if anybody was going to see the airplane incoming, it would have likely been in their scan sector. All right, so it would have been more difficult for the person on the right seat, the pilot being evaluated, and the crew chief on that side to see that plane coming from the other side. I also got questions about, well, why didn't they have an extra crew chief in the left seat? It's not very common to have 2 crew chiefs, right? It just depends on the mission. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But you really only need 1 crew chief typically for most mission sets, and that's pretty much a normal operating procedure. So at the Memorial Bridge, the instructor pilot told the pilot flying they were at 300 and they needed to descend. All right, remember, Memorial Bridge, too high, right? 300 feet would be too high, it said. And then the pilot on the controls on likely the right seat said, okay, well, I'll descend to 200 feet. That's what they said. Cockpit voice recorder from the Black Hawk indicated portion of the transmission stating that the CRJ was circling may not have been received. We hear the word circling on ATC communications, but they don't hear the word circling on the cockpit voice recorder of the Black Hawk. Why is that the case? There's a lot of reasons that could happen. We don't really know the answer, but there could have been interference. The transmission just didn't come through. The radio might have been staticky. There's all kinds of scenarios here. Another likely case, and we're going to see here that the pilot not on the controls, right, which would have been the instructor, was making all the radio calls. Now, when they key the mic, so to speak, right? It's the term we use to say we're going to make a transmission. We can talk on a internal intercom system to the other crew members, but then if I want to make a transmission on the radio, I have to key my mic. So they will have a flight stick, a cyclic stick that looks something like this. All right, this is my little gaming stick that I use, and there's a trigger right here. This trigger is used in some helicopters, like attack helicopters, for guns, but in a Black Hawk, this is how we transmit on the radio. So if I pull this trigger back and I start speaking, now I'm transmitting on whatever radio I've selected. There's also a floor switch available to the pilots, and they can step on the floor switch and make a transmission on the radio. And they also have to talk to each other on these using these mics, right? But on the Black Hawk UH-60 Lima, you push up. There's an additional function to push up on the trigger, and that's how you can talk to other people inside the cockpit. A lot of people who have flown GA airplanes and other aircraft are used to having Vox, right? It's like an automatic voice system where you just talk and the microphone picks up your voice and you can talk to everybody in the cockpit. But the UH-60 Lima doesn't have that, right? You have to actually key the mic in upward motion to talk to anybody inside your aircraft. Right? So you can use the floor switch, and then you have to kind of move your radio select switch if you want to transmit, and otherwise you can bring it back to ICS to talk inside the cockpit. And again, that's either through the floor switch or the trigger, or if you're on the flight controls, you can use the up switch to talk internally amongst your crew. So it's also possible that the Black Hawk crew member, likely the one making the radio calls, was the instructor pilot, could have been keying the mic while that word circling came around, or it could have been another aircraft keying their mic. So on this frequency, on this radio frequency, right, anybody who keys the mic, that's who's talking. And if somebody else keys the mic on top of that, you're going to step on them, and you'll hear that term, they got stepped on, right? You can physically do this with the floor switch if you want. You can like step on somebody, but part of air communications is you listen and you talk, and there's only one person that can talk there's only supposed to be one person talking at any given time, but people step on each other all the time. All right, a lot of my student pilots, there's too much going on in their brain, they're just not even hearing like a radio transmission coming in, and they'll go ahead and key their mic, right, and start talking while somebody else is talking, and then it garbles up the frequency and nobody can hear anything. You'll actually hear this audible squeal a lot of times. That means that two people are talking at the same time, and then everybody has to stop and repeat what they said because nobody heard what happened. All right. So we don't know why they didn't hear the word circling, but or it may not have been received by the Black Hawk. It wasn't on the cockpit voice recorder, so they're still evaluating that. The recorders group is evaluating that at the NTSB. Now, the Black Hawk crew responded that they had traffic in sight. All right. They also talked about another aircraft that had just been cleared for takeoff from runway 01, and that was that American Airlines flight that I discussed in a prior video. And you can see them taking off, and you watch some of the videos of the actual crash. You see this other plane was taking off. So they had just taken off, and there was also another aircraft on approach for runway 01. So there's a lot of traffic going on, and we have somebody departing one, we have somebody arriving one, and in between that we have the CRJ coming in to land 3-3, and then we have the Black Hawk coming from the north. So this is very busy airspace, and there was a lot happening in a small little area. And keep in mind, during all that, we have several more aircraft on approach that are up with the approach controller that aren't close to the airport yet, but they're getting there, right? And they're trying to cycle everybody in, sequence everybody in to come land. Okay, CRJ receives a 1,000-foot automated call out. This is just a system in the CRJ that says 1,000 feet, 500 feet, right? It'll just let you know, a little audible tone. It'll just be like a little voice recording of a little robot voice that tells them that. DCA tower cleared other jet traffic on runway 1 for immediate departure with no delay. We heard that in the prior ATC recordings. The chairman from the NTSB said that they were talking on two different VHF frequencies. And if we look at DCA here, Ronald Reagan, you'll see that we come down to the tower frequencies. There were actually a couple different ones, right? VHF. VHF frequencies always start with a 1. Previously, it had been theorized that maybe the Black Hawk was on the UHF frequency, but they were on two different tower frequencies. Here's a bunch of different tower frequencies. I don't know why they have a bunch of different ones, but it's likely because they're so busy. Now look, here's a helicopter frequency specifically, right? So it could have been the Black Hawk was on 134.35, and then the CRJ was on 119.1 possibly, and that would have led to the tower being able to hear and speak to everybody, but the Black Hawk would have been able to hear the tower talking to the CRJ, but wouldn't have been able to hear the CRJ respond, and vice versa, right? So the CRJ wouldn't have been able to hear what the Black Hawk was saying, but they would have been able to hear tower talking to the Black Hawk. Okay, 32 seconds before impact, Black Hawk passed the southern tip of Haines Point. This was 32 seconds before the collision. It was at Haines Point, right in this area. A second later, the CRJ began a left roll to turn on the final runway 33. So remember, they're coming from the south, and they were a little bit to the west. They had to kind of circle around and come in. Now they're in the left bank coming in for runway 33 here. They received their 500-foot call out 20 seconds before impact. Tower was audible asking the Black Hawk if the CRJ was in sight. They also heard that conflict alert. And this right here is that ATC or the radar screen that we see, and you see that CA, right? So they heard the conflict alert in the tower. I guess they got an audible conflict alert message and warning that these aircraft were approaching each other. The CRJ also received a TCAS alert. Now this is the Traffic Alert and Collision Avoidance System, and most, I think all airlines have TCAS. So I'm not sure if they all are equipped with this, but most of them do at least. And this is just an additional means. I don't have a lot of experience with TCAS myself. I played around with it in a simulator once in a 737 sim, but it will warn them that there's traffic, right? So they got an alert, and this was 19 seconds before the collision is when they heard traffic. We all heard that the Black Hawk was directed to pass behind the CRJ. Now, first of all, if a tower ever tells me to pass behind a CRJ, I'm going to say no thanks, because These big jets create a huge wake turbulence behind them, right? They're creating a vortex off the tip of their wings, right? These vortices, and it creates this huge wake, and you don't want to fly in that because it's extremely turbulent, right? So if they told me pass behind the CRJ, I would say no thanks, I'm not going to do that. Can I hold here instead, or turn back, or anything else, right? But I'm not going to pass behind a CRJ. Now, regardless, the pass behind the, right, they put that in quotes, may not have been received by the Blackhawk. Transmission was stepped on by a 0.8 second mic key from the Blackhawk. Now, likely that would have been from the pilot, the instructor pilot, because he was the pilot making all the radio calls. It's possible it could have been the pilot on the controls, or it could have even been from the crew chief. The crew chief has the ability to transmit on radios as well, but they pretty much never do, so it's very unlikely that it was the crew chief. It's most likely it was the pilot, the instructor pilot, who keyed the mic, but we don't know who it was. Regardless, they were stepping on that frequency, so that part of the message didn't come through, right? They didn't hear pass behind the. So I know a lot of people were saying that they were told to pass behind the CRJ, it's their fault. Well, if they didn't hear it, then that's a problem, right? This is why radio communications are so important with air traffic. Everybody has to make sure we're on the same page. And in my first video, I said, it sounds to me like no, they weren't on the same sheet of music here, right? They weren't all reading from the same sheet of music. There was some confusion and there was some miscommunication. The Blackhawk crew indicated that the traffic was in sight and requested visual separation. Again, were they talking about the CRJ that was coming in, or were they talking about the aircraft that just took off, or the other aircraft that was on approach for runway 01? We don't know yet which aircraft the Blackhawk was talking about. I think this is going to possibly be a really important part of this investigation, is trying to ascertain what exactly that pilot, who was the instructor pilot, was talking about when he said traffic in sight, right? Because that's all he said was traffic in sight, and the tower said, do you see that CRJ traffic? They weren't really specific on where they were. So that's part of this miscommunication between everybody here, is they may have been talking about two different aircraft, but they thought they were talking about the same aircraft. And we know they requested visual separation. It was granted. So at this point, we're 7 seconds before impact. The CRJ rolled out on final, right? Which means they likely would not have been in any kind of bank at this point. They would have been level wings and descending onto final. Now the last radio altitude, they explain what this is, and essentially this is just their height off the ground. The last radio altitude recorded by the CRJ, 313 feet, and was recorded 2 seconds prior to the collision. It also said they were descending at 448 feet per minute. 448 divided by 60 is 7.5 feet per second. So times that by 2. 2 seconds, we lost another 15 feet. So they were 313 feet 2 seconds before and descending. However, right, it's possible they lost another 15 feet, but here's the other thing. The pitch up at this time was 9 degrees nose up. And here's this roll I was talking about in another video, right? 11 degrees left wing down. So I was watching that video, or in a previous video, I was talking about how I think the CRJ not only pitched up, but made a left bank, right? And so this confirms what I had said earlier based on the video that we saw. So in fact, the CRJ did make a left bank. If I had an aircraft that I saw last minute coming out the right side, right, coming right at me out my right door, and I saw it last minute, I think I would instinctively do exactly the same thing. I would pull up and I would bank left in an effort to get as much space between me and that aircraft as possible. So I think they probably saw the Blackhawk at the very last second and did their very best to get out of the way. Now, here's where we hear about the radar altitude of the Blackhawk. It says it was at 278 feet. And it had been for the previous 5 seconds. They said the pitch was 0.5 degree nose up and 1.6 degrees of bank. All right, so that's not really very much. That's pretty much wings level, right? They're like just a little up and just a very slight left bank. The CRJ, on the other hand, 11 degrees left wing down and 9 degrees nose up. 9 degrees nose up is fairly significant, and 11 degrees left wing down is, I mean, it's not a steep bank by any means, all right, but it's a lot more than where the Blackhawk was, right? This is like pretty much wings level right here, and this is normal for just basic corrections of maintaining pitch and level wings. So they are confident the radar altitude of the Blackhawk at the time was 278 feet. All right, she also said, I want to caution, this doesn't mean that's what the Blackhawk crew was seeing on the barometric altimeters in the cockpit. They're seeing conflicting data, which is why they aren't releasing the altitude of the Blackhawk's route. So let's look at this cockpit again. When we look at the cockpit, on the left side, we have an instrument panel, and on the right side, we have the same exact instrument panel. All right, you'll see a couple variations, a couple little extra buttons here and there, but those are really relevant to this topic. Right here, you're going to see two dials on each side. We have the same two over here, and these are the altimeters. You have two. One of them is the radar altimeter, or the radio altimeter, right? This tells you how high you are off the ground. The next one is the barometric altitude, which tells you how high you are above the mean sea level of the Earth. Now this one gets calibrated by a little thing called a Coldsman window, and this is where you may have hear in movies all the time, pilots altimeter setting 3014. Okay, great. So they have to set that into their altimeter. And in my previous video, I showed there can be up to a 75-foot error on that altimeter, and that's acceptable, right? So wherever they took off from, which I don't know yet, it may have been Davison Army Airfield, they would have got the local altimeter setting, and we can even look at that right now. So as I'm recording this, I look at KDAA, I look at weather, and I look over here, it says A3026. So their altimeter setting right now, anybody leaving Davison Army Airfield is going to set now their altimeter 30.26 inches of mercury. And then that should calibrate their altimeter, and the altitude should read 74 feet on that barometric altimeter at that elevation. Within 75, right, is the standard. So it's got to be within 75 feet of that to be a valid altimeter setting. Now these altimeters get set separately, all right? It's very typical for the crew to coordinate and say, hey, I've got 3024 set left, 3024 set right. All right, cool. We're both on the same page. We both have our altimeters reading the same, right? And we're going to check to make sure they're reading like at least close to being accurate between each other. Right? But it's very possible that they got an updated altimeter setting. The pilot who was on the controls didn't want to let go of the controls to reset their altimeter, or who knows, right? So it's possible that they both had two different altimeter settings, because up here you can see there was a conflict. Back earlier on, the Black Hawk was 1 nautical mile west of the Key Bridge. All right, so here's the Key Bridge. They're a mile west, and the pilot flying indicated they're at 300 feet. Instructor pilot said they were at 400 feet. So they're getting two different readings. Neither pilot made a comment discussing the discrepancy. We don't know why there's a discrepancy at the time, right? They're investigating. So they were pretty much close to the sea level here, right? So maybe one person was looking at the radar altimeter and the other person was talking about the barometric altimeter, and there was a little bit of a difference. One may have been they may have been both talking about barometric altimeters, but they had different altimeter settings in, right? That's also possible. Here's another thing they haven't discussed yet, is the heads-up display. The heads-up display is an optional little monocle that'll go onto the night vision, onto the NVGs, and it will tell you what your altitude is on that little monocle, right? It's another display to tell you what your altitude is, both off the ground and radar altitude and barometric altitude. Now in the Lima, you have to manually calibrate the barometric altitude for the heads-up display. All right, it's beyond what it's reading right here. You have to. There's an additional step to set that barometric altitude. So I think it should be a really important part of the investigation is whether or not they were using the heads-up display or not. It's an optional piece of equipment. Not everybody wears it. But if the pilots were using, or even one pilot was using the heads-up display, then they would have needed to calibrate the barometric altitude for the heads-up display in addition to calibrating their barometric altimeters with a altimeter setting. So that could have been another reason why they were talking about two different altitudes here. So the big takeaway here is there was an altitude discrepancy of some sort, and we don't know why, right? So it does appear that based on the radar altitude data, the Black Hawk was 78 feet high, right? Remember, that's measured off the belly of the Black Hawk, so you still have the whole height of the Black Hawk above that, right? And they were restricted to 200 feet here. I will tell you that it's very easy to get 78 feet off, and you can do that in a matter of seconds, right? I mean, I'm talking just a couple of seconds. You can be that far off your altitude, and all it takes is, hey, I need to focus. I'm trying to talk to a radio control tower. I'm trying to talk to another aircraft. I'm focusing on a fuel check. There's all kinds of reasons why we might be distracted. I'm looking at something else. I'm looking at for other air traffic, and then I look at my altitude. Oh shoot, hey, I'm 78 feet too high. I got to descend. I got to get down. All right, this can happen very quickly, And there are no pilot, any pilot who tells you that they've never been off altitude is lying to you, right? And every pilot who says they've been perfect on their altitude, every flight they've ever flown, I've never exceeded or, gotten above or below my assigned altitude, they're lying to you. There's no way. Now, it does look like that altitude discrepancy, and this, again, they're saying they're not releasing this data yet. But if indeed they were 78 feet too high, that was like the nail in the coffin, so to speak, that actually caused them to collide. Let's just imagine they were at 200 feet. They would have passed so unbelievably close underneath that CRJ. It would have been terrifying, and there would have been a massive investigation on that near miss if it would have been a near miss, which unfortunately it ended up being a terrible tragedy instead of a near miss. There are near misses that get reported all the time, and there are investigations. The NTSB comes out and does investigations about this, makes recommendations, but you just don't hear about them on the news because it doesn't end in tragedy, right? It's a near miss, and then everybody survives, right, and everything's fine. But I mean, 78 feet is an incredibly, incredibly small margin for vertical separation. So we'll have to see what else comes out of this, and let's listen to a little bit more of what they said here.
That does not mean what the Black Hawk, that's what the Black Hawk crew was seeing.
So let's listen in.
On the barometric altimeters in the cockpit, we are seeing conflicting information in the data, which is why we aren't releasing altitude for the Black Hawk's entire route.
So you can watch this video for yourself, but Sean Payne goes on to talk about how they had bad data that's unreliable. Why is it bad? No idea. Was it damaged in the crash? Or they said there was some water in these flight data recorders. Maybe it was damaged. Somehow the data is bad and they can't use it. So these things weren't recorded. We just don't know, right? That's a problem. So they're basically going off of the radar altimeter on the Black Hawk, which is pretty accurate, right? And it should tell us where that Black Hawk was, how high off the Potomac it was. So 278 feet. In my experience, those are pretty valid numbers.
Counts for the local pressure at the time of the flight. Again, this was not recorded by the FDR.
Okay, so I encourage you to watch this video for yourself and hear some of the data straight from the NTSB. And you, of course, you can go check out on their website. They have the statements that are printed out here. And let me know what you think. Again, this doesn't tell us, anything about fault, and there's probably going to be a bunch of people who comment on this video saying who's at fault, and that's not what the NTSB is doing right now. We're trying to figure out what happened and what exactly caused this. What we do know so far is that there's definitely a miscommunication, and this happens all the time. That's why I encourage my students all the time, like, hey, are you sure we know exactly what the tower told us to do? Are we sure that we know what that aircraft is doing, right? If there's any confusion, hey, let's make another radio call and make sure, right? Always trust but verify, and just ensure everybody's on the same sheet of music. It's happened very many times, and actually it just happened to me the other night. I was told by the tower, they told me to look at the right front, and there's an aircraft. Watch out for that aircraft. And I was like, okay, I see them. And they're like, it's a Huey. And I just saw the light through my NVGs. I saw their landing lights and their position lights. The tower was actually telling me about a different aircraft that was at my 3 o'clock. And I looked over and I eventually saw it and was like, oh, that's the one they were talking about, right? He told me to look right front. Well, there was an aircraft at my right front, but really he was talking about the other aircraft out my right, just to the right side. And so I said, I have the traffic in sight, and I was talking about a different aircraft, Now, we didn't get that close to each other, so it didn't end up being an issue. But I called the tower afterwards, and I was like, hey, we actually had a miscommunication there, right? You and I were not on the same sheet of music. You were talking about a different aircraft. I thought you were talking about this other one. And I told you I had them in sight. In fact, I didn't. I didn't have the one you were talking about in sight. And so I was like, let's, next time I'll make sure I confirm with you, and let's do a better job of confirming with each other in the future. Right? Tower operator that I work with all the time. So these things do happen, and unfortunately, this led to a disaster. As a reminder, all of the proceeds from my channel for this month and the month of January are going to be going to the Brotalion Blue Skies Foundation fundraiser for the Pat 25 crew. And I would also ask anybody watching this video, if you have the means, go to GoFundMe.com and go donate to some of the families of the victims of this terrible, terrible tragedy. I hope this video was helpful from a pilot standpoint and showing you what some of these things mean that they were talking about, because I know it can be a little bit confusing. And I just wanted you to kind of see what it may have looked like through those NVGs and what their cockpit looks like and what they were actually seeing, and a little bit about this actual route here. And I'll stress, no matter how many times I say this, some people will get in the comments and say that I'm blaming somebody. I'm not blaming anyone here. I just want to understand what happened in this crash and share that with people who aren't as familiar with the aviation industry. Thanks so much for watching again. Snak Pak out.